Hugh is visiting St John's College, which housed officer cadets during the First World War, and which he himself attended 60 years later.
I started there in the 80s. I imagine I was going to places that my grandfather had been at previously, but I've no idea what he did or what the officer training school was.
Hugh is meeting Professor Gary Sheffield, an expert on the history of officer training during the First World War.
Hey Gary, how are you?
Good to meet you.
That's it. This is rather odd for me because this is my old college.
Right.
Before coming to Cambridge for officer training, Ronald Dennis had joined the army as a private soldier. Gary has found a copy of his military service record.
Would you like to start by looking at this form?
Right, so this is an application for admission to an officer cadet unit.
He's been talent spotted. He's in training as an ordinary soldier. Someone has recognised that there is some sort of potential for leadership there, and so therefore he's recommended to be commissioned.
And was it unusual for grammar school boys to get commissions, or how did that work?
Before the war, definitely yes. The vast majority of officers came from public schools. But during the war itself, well, given the huge casualties, particularly among officers, the army was actively looking to recruit talented soldiers, no matter what their social background, and to some degree, social snobbery goes out the window. Actually, it's, can you do the job?
That's fascinating.
The First World War had taken a huge toll on the officer class. During the worst periods of the war, the average life expectancy of a junior officer on the Western Front was just 6 weeks. Many of these public school boys who would have been undergraduates were now fighting and dying on the front. Meanwhile, back in Cambridge, whole colleges had been commandeered by the army to train a new generation of officers from very different social backgrounds.
Now what's happening now? This is target practice.
That's right. There's a really nice photo there.
So this is bayoneting bags of something, sandbags.
This is bayonet training. This is the sort of obvious military tactics training.
What a weird sort of conflict of worlds almost, isn't it? Because this is the real kind of centre of learning, isn't it? And kind of intellectual learning. Then on the grass at the back, people are bayoneting sandbags.
There's a very interesting photo here I'd like to have a look at.
Oh, so this is the kind of formal medieval dining hall, and this is all the officer cadets being kind of served, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah.
Wow.
The army had a strong belief that soldiers would only follow gentlemen, and gentlemen had an ethos which fitted them out to be leaders. Officer training is not just about tactics. It's not just about learning to be an officer in the technical sense. It's about learning to be a gentleman if you're not born or educated as one. So on some occasions you would actually have instructors sitting on the same table as them checking their table manners.
They're learning all that stuff about, do you lean to the left or the right when the wine
and the way to pass the port and all the rest of it, yeah.
So it was a proper training course in moving up a social class, wasn't it?
It absolutely was. And of course, if you think about, Ronald would have done this or something very similar to this. Coming from his background, suddenly he's in a medieval hall, high table off to one side, being served dinner, a new experience.
Great, so yeah.
Been talking about this idea of creating gentlemen. There's an interesting little poem written here called A Perfect Course. Perhaps if you'd like to have a look at the last verse.
It's 1 star now and a Sam Brown belt, and a temporary gentleman too. So remember, my boy, whenever you go, the varsity you've been through. Well,
for me, this really captures what it's about. I mean, a temporary gentleman. This is actually a dreadfully snobbish term that was bandied around at the beginning of the war. Officers like Ronald would have been hold temporary commissions. They would have been known as temporary officers, as in, once the war was over, they'd be back to civilian life. But the assumption was, and it's a very snobbish assumption, that these people would only have the manners and the bearing of an officer, of a gentleman, you know, for the period the war's going on.
So it must have been very difficult, I guess. You know, your father is literally on the coalface, and then you're brought to these ridiculously plush, really, isn't it, surroundings in Cambridge. So how long would he have been here then? Just six months?
Six months. It was a 6 months course, and at the end of it he would have gone off to join his unit.
Between periods of military training, the cadets in Cambridge were encouraged to take part in all the traditional activities of student life, playing sports, punting on the river, and rowing.
I should think Ronald, my grandfather, found it very, very strange to be here. I should think this was unlike anywhere he'd imagined he would end up. Well, I don't suppose any of this felt very real to him. I don't think it could. I think it's probably taken from about here. There's a pub in this shot called the Fort St George, which is just there. So it's definitely here. So this is obviously the end of his time here because the leaves are on the trees. He started in January and he was only doing 6 months. So, you know, this is spring or early summer. As the end came to his time here, I think he can only have viewed leaving here with sort of trepidation, really. According to my dad, Ronald only arrived in France in the last weeks of the war and was quite badly wounded. I need to find out what happened to him.
Hugh is visiting the Imperial War Museum in London. He's meeting military historian Nigel Steele.
Hi, Hugh. Hi. But what I'm interested in is my grandfather when he leaves Cambridge and heads off to war.
Well, I mean, the first thing, I think, is his medal index record. And what's useful about the medal index record is it actually gives us the date he arrives in France.
So he goes to France on the 12th of October
1918.
So and the war ends on the 11th of the 11th of 18. Although presumably there is a bit of stuff after that, isn't there?
There's a month to go. But what's interesting about entering the Western Front at the beginning, middle of October, is that you're almost at the climax of the war. There are large numbers of German soldiers who are fighting as hard as they've ever fought. And although we can historically see that there may only be a month left, it doesn't make a difference. He doesn't know that.
By October 1918, the fighting on the Western Front was getting ever more desperate. The stalemate of trench warfare had been replaced by chaotic mobile combat across devastated terrain. The Germans had fallen back towards the Belgian border, close to the River Sambre. So the British High Command planned a major assault to smash these new German lines.
And what does he do when he arrives then?
Well, he was a platoon commander. So he would have been in command of a group of 30, 35 men.
He's 19, isn't he?
He's 19 years old. He's just arrived from Britain. There's a group of maybe 25, 30 hardened soldiers from the north of England, and you've been plonked from nowhere on the top. I mean, it's an intimidating prospect.
The target of Ronald's platoon was the village of Fouteuil. To capture it, Ronald would have to lead his men through more than a mile of fierce German defences.
The attack takes place at 5 o'clock in the morning. It's very dark. There's a mist floating around. It's going to be extremely noisy. The shells will start flying in both directions instantaneously. Machine guns will crack out. You're not really going to be able to see where you're actually going. So very soon casualties will fall. I think the battle will degenerate into an almost inconceivable, terrifying experience.
Despite the German resistance, Ronald and his battalion successfully captured the village of Futoy, but they suffered heavy losses.
The battalion was unlucky in losing 13 officer casualties. 5 killed, 8 wounded. And he gets wounded.
He gets wounded.
On this day.
That's right. Yes, we know that because if we go down the rest of the medical reports that we've actually got for him, and this is the description of the wound that he actually gets.
Wounded as above by fragments of shell wound or something, yeah, upper arm right. And what does shell mean in that instance? Does that mean artillery shell, or does that mean...
Yes, an artillery shell that would have been fired and burst into fragments, and this large lump of hot metal would have flown towards him and ripped across his arm. It's all healed up within 2 or 3 weeks, so it's actually not that bad, but it's bad enough to take you off the battlefield.
Lucky. Very lucky. You know, tiny bit higher,
That's
tiny
right.
bit to the left.
Mm.
That's where luck is on his side.
It does seem to be. When you look at the way it pans out for him, he could be somebody you could say had a lucky war.
Yeah, well, a very, very lucky one.
Following his injury at Futoy, Ronald Dennis was sent home to England to recover. After the war, he left the army, married, and became a secondary school teacher. He died in 1990, aged 91.
I wonder, when I hear about his service, whether he rather underestimated what he had achieved. I mean, what I'm rather proud of, really, is the fact that, you know, when he was called upon, he did the thing that he was called upon to do. Without my grandfather's journey, I don't suppose my life would be in any sense the same, because his story, it seems to me, is one of social mobility, really, which had only started to become possible at that point. And if none of that had happened, I wouldn't be here, so...
Now Hugh wants to explore the very different war experience of his other grandfather, Godfrey Hindles.
My mum's dad obviously had this very long war. I don't want to know where he fought and what his story was, really, because I know even less about that, and there's more to know, really.
Hugh's Aunt Margaret has come up to London to share her memories of her father.
How lovely to see you. Long time.
It's a small room you've got here.
Extraordinary. So, there we are.
Now, Mum said, and this is why I'm here, really, that you would know more about your father's kind of war record.
Yes, I think possibly I do.
Than she does.
Yes, I do. We've got photographs here, and this is one that was particularly, I knew so well. It's a family gathering. There's his beloved brother Frank, who just joined up, and there's my father, still in civvies. Frank then went off and got killed at Gallipoli.
Well, how old was he then? He was 17?
17, yes. And he was his best friend. And there was my father towards the end of the war, I take it.
This is a group of sergeants, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
He was in the war for a long time, wasn't he? So
Yes, he
joined up
was, both in France and in Belgium.
And did he tell you any kind of specifics of his war?
I don't know how I know this story. You have to understand that I don't know. But he was on a hill with an enormous amount of British troops, and the Germans surrounded them, and at the end of the battle there were 9 of them left, 9 British, and the Germans had really won.